Hi, loves. Today we're going to do a little bit of notes about the introduction to forensics, just a little background information about forensic science, where it came from, what it's doing, how it's progressed over the last few centuries. So I have attached to your Google Classroom the document that you can fill in as you watch the video. Those of you who are in class, I may do it live. I may let you just watch the video on your own. Those of you who are at home, obviously you can watch the video at home and then not have to be tuned into me all day long, which is great. Okay, so first things first, what is forensic science? Forensic science is the application of science to criminal and civil laws that are enforced by police agencies in our criminal justice system. So it's basically using the laws and kind of using science to help prove or disprove or enforce those laws. Technical support by crime labs is generally divided into 5 areas. So you have your physical science unit, your biology unit, your firearms unit, your document examination unit, and your photography unit. So I know that I mentioned this at some point in the last couple of weeks, that then, for example, NCIS, where Abby does all of it, it's not actually that realistic, I guess is the word I'm looking for. It's not really that realistic. It would be way too much for one person to do. And when people work in a lab, they really like you to have an expertise. I think I mentioned that I have a friend who works for the state crime lab, and he does toxicology and only toxicology. He does not analyze fingerprints. He does not analyze DNA. He doesn't analyze anything else. He does toxicology. So the physical science unit compares physical evidence. Excuse me. The biology unit investigates blood samples and blood, body fluids, hair, and DNA. So he would probably be within the biology unit if that's how they were designing the New York State lab as well, because he does, like I said, toxicology. You can't really get a lot of tox information without blood samples or body fluids. Sometimes you can do it with hair too. The firearms unit does all of your bullets, your cartridges, your casings, your ballistics. The documentation does handwriting analysis, paper analysis. Probably not fingerprinting. Fingerprinting would be physical. Sorry. And then the last one is the photography unit, records and examines crime scenes and individual physical evidence. If I can move this. I can. Look at that. That's right. It is crime scene. Look at that. Like, you really need to see my face. All right. So in addition, some labs, like I said, will offer toxicology, computer and digital analysis, voice print analysis, polygraph administration. Polygraph is, of course, your lie detector test. My brain is blank. It's 8-9. It's almost the end of the day. This is what happens, 8-9 on the opposite day when you guys aren't with me. And then forensic entomology, which is insects and bugs and how those are evidence for, typically it's used evidence for time of death calculations and things like that. How long a body has been there and been decomposing is predictable through insect life cycles. What is forensic science? The word forensic means anything pertaining to or used in a court of law. It also means rhetorical or argumentative. So I just put like a picture of a forensics kit here. In the United States of America, forensics was a fairly obscure topic for the general public until the double murder trial of, everybody hopes you know, this picture gives it away, of, hi, where's my animation? It should be O.J. Simpson. So O.J. Simpson was accused of killing his, I believe at that point was ex-wife. I can't remember if they were still married or not. I was young when this happened. Ex-wife and a friend of hers. So Nicole Brown Simpson was her name, and Ronald Goldman, I believe, is the other guy's name. I can't remember, but you could look that up. It's a fairly famous case in the mid-90s, I would say. I was in elementary school, so it was a long time ago. But in that case, there was a lot of different forensic techniques used, and that was one of the really, not the first, but like one of the first times it was really kind of widely used. So the first place we know of, without question, that forensics was really being used was in China in the 700s. So the Chinese were using fingerprints to establish the identity of documents and clay sculptures way back in the 700s. So quite a long time ago. Now, they weren't using them to solve crimes yet, but they were using the concepts that we now think of today to help identify various things in their culture. In 1248, Sidwan Hugh wrote a book entitled The Washing Away of Wrongs. It describes how to distinguish drowning from strangulation. So that's another thing that we would use in present day. Now, of course, some of the science has changed or been improved over the years, but it describes how to distinguish drowning from strangulation. So what's the difference in the body that you'd see that you would notice? And it was the first recorded application of medical knowledge to solve a crime. So that's like the first time they were using it to actually help in the criminal justice field. In 1609, the first paper on systematic document examination was published in France. Then in 1784, one of the first documented uses of physical matching saw an Englishman convicted of murder based on the torn edge of a wad of newspaper in a pistol that matched the piece of the remaining piece in his pocket. So they're looking at the tear mark, and they're actually matching these tear marks up and saying, oh no, this is the same piece of paper. It's the same, tear mark, and this is definitely this little wad that was found in the pistol. Definitely came from that paper that was in that guy's pocket. Forensics in the 1800s. In the 1800s, the field of forensic science saw substantial milestones, including Matthew Orfila, I don't know how to say his name, considered the father of modern toxicology. He developed one of the first reliable tests for the presence of blood and is credited as the first attempt to use a microscope in the assessment of blood and semen stains. So this was way before you would have been using microscopes for that kind of thing. And also there are tests now to test for the presence of blood. There are various tests. The most common one is the phenolphthalein test, and the presence of, I believe it only tests for human blood, specifically human blood, which is nice because if you happen to have a butcher who is under suspicion of a crime, he might be covered in animal blood because he's a butcher, but you want to know if he's covered in human blood. So the phenolphthalein test will do that for you, and it usually is it turns like a hot pink when you test it. There are a number of other tests for substances. There is the luminol test, which is the one you typically see on TV, where they use the black light then to show the luminol glows, and it's gross. That's for other bodily fluids, not just blood. There's also something called leucomalachite green. We'll get to all this when we do that stuff. But there are a number of other different kinds of tests that will test for the presence of something. So it doesn't necessarily tell you much about the blood or the semen or any of those other stains, but it will tell you that it exists. So then if you find it at a crime scene, then you sample it, or you cut out the piece of carpet or the piece of whatever that has it on there. You bring it back to the lab, and they'll do a DNA analysis or some other sort of toxicology analysis on the bodily fluid, whatever it is, to maybe learn more from it. Maybe then you can get a blood type. You might be able to get a gender. You might be able to get more information about the person if you can test the DNA. But you can't really do that on site. Whereas you can do these, they call them presumptive tests. A lot of those presumptive tests you can do right on site in the crime scene and see, okay, if it's present, then we'll take this stuff back to the lab and test it further. If it's just like red paint, then we don't need to test that. In the 1800s, the field, I already read that part. So in 1835, Henry Goddard first used the bullet comparison to catch a murderer. His comparison was based on a visible flaw in the bullet, which was traced back to the mold, which is similar to what we do with ballistics now. Each gun, even if it's the same type of gun, creates a unique pattern on the bullet when the bullet is fired out of the gun. So they're called lands and grooves, and they're unique. They usually have unique notches, and there's also a part of the gun that bangs on the end of the bullet. It's called the breech of the bullet, and that will leave a unique mark as well. So you kind of are working to match those up. And again, these are all things we're going to get into when we do these units. This is also the first use of photography for the identification of criminals and documentation of evidence and crime scenes. So before that, people weren't walking through the crime scene and taking a whole bunch of pictures. They were just probably taking notes, I guess. But you can imagine how easily that could be misconstrued or not remembered the same way or anything like that. So having that physical documentation and evidence of the crime scenes to look back at later. Sometimes these things, especially present day, these crimes won't go to trial for 8-10 months, a year. And so now these people have to go on the stand. They're the crime scene analysis people, and they have to go on the stand and they have to testify that this is blah, 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 blah. And they have to pretend that they remember and pretend that they haven't been at, 20 other crime scenes since then. So that's why the pictures are so important, because then obviously they should be able to remember, but this will help jog their memory and they can remember exactly where things were and where they were found and whatnot. The first recorded use of fingerprints were to solve a crime and development of the first microscope was with a comparison bridge was also in the 1800s. So a comparison bridge is basically where you would have a microscope where you have two eyepieces. So you're looking through two oculars, but your right eye is looking at one stage and your left eye is looking at another stage. So then you are able to compare two things right next to each other. You compare pieces of hair and you can see if they're the same. You can compare bullet casings. You can compare all sorts of different things to see if they are the same. So you're usually looking through one set of oculars, but you're looking at like a split screen inside the microscope because you've got two different stages with two different things on it. And that's what a comparison bridge or a comparison microscope does. Forensic science was significantly applied in 1888 when doctors in London, England, were allowed to examine the victims of Jack the Ripper for wound patterns. So they're looking at wound patterns, they're looking at what kind of weapon made the patterns or what was used to cause these injuries. In the 1800s, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who you may have heard of, is the guy who published the Sherlock Holmes books, also became like a thing. So now people are starting to write about forensics and be involved in that kind of thing. In the early 1900s, the early part of the century, there was a French scientist named Edmund Locard. Now, Locard established the Institute of Criminalistics. He also developed what's called now as the Locard's exchange principle, which basically says that when two objects come in contact with each other, a cross-transfer of material occurs. So what this means is that every time, for example, I'm sitting on this chair right now. This chair is a little bit of like fabric. It's not a hard chair like the kids' desk chairs. Probably some fibers from my pants are going to be stuck on the chair. Probably some fibers from the chair will be stuck on my pants. It's not noticeable, but if you were to examine it, you might be able to pick up some fibers because there's a transfer of materials across those two barriers. It's the same concept of everything you touch, you leave a fingerprint. Everywhere you go, especially if you're me, you leave hair. Maybe not everybody, but God, I leave hair everywhere I go. Things like that. So the concept is basically that if you have been somewhere, then you have left a part of yourself there. It may be skin cells, it may be hair cells, it may be fibers from the clothes that you were wearing, and you have probably taken something from that location with you. Again, fibers from the location you're wearing. Maybe it's something on the bottom of your shoe that was in the carpet, anything like that. So that's what Locard's exchange principle is. It has to do with that exchange of materials, which is a really big thing when you think about developing evidence and creating a hypothesis on what happened and being able to prove that someone was or was not in a particular location. I think that might be the last one, almost. Scientific method. You guys do a ton of scientific method before you get to me, so I don't really need to do a lot of this, but it's just important to kind of frame it in a scientific method way because you always start with a question in the scientific method. Start with the question, you do a little bit of research, you come up with a hypothesis you think is the answer, then you test it. Okay, well, let's find out. Let's question victims. Let's question suspects. Okay, now I have a new hypothesis because that one didn't pan out, so throw that out. We got to do a little more research, new hypothesis, more questions, more people to talk to. And eventually, hopefully, you come up with a conclusion. That is ultimately the goal. A lot of times you circle around that research hypothesis section first before you move on to your conclusion, your results and your conclusion. But it's just always important because it is a science class to kind of think of it in terms of the scientific method and to help organize your thoughts, your whatever evidence you've picked up, conversations you've had, things like that. So I think that's it for this one. Obviously, if I went too fast because I'm reading it to no one, you can pause it and replay and rewind if you've missed any spots. That's the magic of the videotape. And if you have any questions, just let me know. I'll talk to you all soon. Stop recording. Okay, bye.